This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A cattle market update with Lee Schultz, a livestock economist from Iowa State University, begins today's show. Lee reviews recent USDA reports in an article he wrote about how cattle are categorized. K-State soil fertility specialist Dorvar Ruiz-Diaz continues the show as he discusses what producers need to think about for soil pH when it comes to planting alfalfa. He also mentions a few other nutrient considerations. And rounding out today's show is K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Today he talks about the Wildlife and Outdoor Enterprise Management Program at K-State and the dangers of birds using twine in their nest. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show as we normally do with a cattle market update. And this week we're joined by Iowa State University livestock economist Lee Schultz. Lee, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be back with you.
Lee, starting off our conversation with just a rundown of the cattle market.
This week, I think we've seen much of the same, a lot of sideways trade really since late July. Now, overall, as you look at fed cattle futures, they were down between about $1 to $2, maybe a little bit more on some of those contracts. Really, I think those futures are looking for an indication from the cash market. We're seeing relatively strong basis levels. They maybe have narrowed a bit here in the last couple of weeks. But really, I think the market's looking for something to react to, and that's what we need to continue to watch for futures. Feeder cattle continues to be a relatively strong market. Maybe the bit of a step back this last week was due to that weakness in futures prices for fed cattle, as well as a little bit of strength in the corn market. I think roughly up about 5 to 6 cents here as we look at the two contracts yet here in 2023. So again, a lot of the same as what we've seen here this last week. I think where we did see some action is certainly as you look at one, I'll point out the slaughter levels. We came off the prior week of one of the smallest August slaughter levels back to 2016. So that gives an indication of the tighter supplies, but I think a little bit of the slower demand for packers right now as packer margins have been relatively tight. That has worked to strengthen some of those wholesale values. Wholesale prices were up, roughly 2 to 4% this last week. You got to give credit to Thursday. Thursday, we've seen a big jump in choice, especially in the choice cutout, which maybe is an indication we are seeing a bit of a seasonal rally here as we get into starting to price here now for Labor Day, which isn't too far away.
Lee, oftentimes when you join us, we talk about a few reports from the USDA, and the first one we wanted to mention was cattle on feed.
Yeah, I'm the lucky one. It seems like my rotation comes up here when we get on cattle on feed. So we look at cattle on feed numbers. So we're reporting as of August 1 for cattle on feed, and then placements and marketings both in July. So remember, we're roughly about 3 weeks kind of later as we think about the data. The overall impressions of the report are that supplies are down. As we look across cattle on feed numbers, we're down 2.3% down compared to a year ago. Placements were down 8.3%. That was the big surprise in the report. Pre-report had them down roughly 5.5%, but again, we're 8.3%. So I think that's an indication that those supplies are certainly tightening. That really comes in line with what we've seen in the cattle inventory report. Those feeder cattle supplies outside of feedlots were as tight as we've ever seen back to 2014. I think only 2014 was about 100,000 head fewer. So again, this is a real indication we're seeing tightening. Marketings were down 5.3% compared to the prior year. When I look at the state makeup where, we've seen some larger cattle on feed numbers, you have to really point to the north here. So Minnesota was up 12% compared to a year ago. Iowa, we're up 2%. You compare that to some other states. Colorado was down 6%. Nebraska down 2%. So it's not necessarily more placements, but I think we've seen a bit of slower marketings here in July. That's due to, I think some packers running a bit slower over that period with some days off for some maintenance. And that really showed up in some of those marketing numbers, which build up some cattle supplies in particular states. This isn't an indication that supplies are growing or anything. I think it is just an indication of maybe those slower marketings. Cattle supplies remain very tight, and that is supportive of the markets.
Was that really any of a surprise then for you?
No, I think, if this market, if we're going to read it, it may be a bit of a bullish report, especially when you look at those placement numbers. So if I'm looking for any reaction, it is a bit of a bullish, and maybe will give some legs to this market.
And then another report that came out from the USDA recently named farm computer usage and ownership. So maybe not as much cattle related, but important for producers still.
It is. And this, when I was looking at the USDA reports on the calendar, it showed up that this was released on August 17th. And it isn't really a routine report. It's released every other year in odd years. It's part of the June survey. They asked producers a wide variety of questions as it relates to technology. I'll give you one example here. Let's just use Kansas because I know a lot of our listeners are from there. One question is that do farms purchase agricultural inputs over the internet? And in Kansas, 46% of farms do. That doesn't mean they purchase all their inputs necessarily, but they do purchase some inputs. So, just under a half. When they asked, do you conduct agricultural marketing activities over the internet? Again, in Kansas, about 37% of farms. So a little bit lower when you think about marketing compared to purchasing inputs, but a relatively good share. And that share has grown a bit since 2001 when they did the survey. The question that maybe surprised me the most is relative to USDA reports. So again, let's use Kansas farms here. And a question about, do they access USDA NASS reports over the internet? There's a lot of USDA NASS reports, right? Only 21% of farms did that. And that is up from 2021, but that seems like a relatively small share to me, given the number of reports that are published by USDA NASS and the information that is available. Also, when you think about other reports, which, I think for the cattle market are important when you think about agricultural marketing service reports. So the various fed cattle reports, feeder cattle reports that they have, only 33% of Kansas farms access those reports via the internet. So it's hard to give a basis for it if that's a large number or not. But for me, that seems like a relatively small number or percentage of farms given the amount of information that's available. So maybe that's a challenge for me from producers out there to maybe go check out some of those reports that are available, some of the reports that we talk about here on this show, but also some that are available on the website that may help producers in understanding the products that they're marketing and give a better sense of market intel.
And one more thing, Lee, that we're going to talk about today, an article that you recently wrote, A Cow is a Cow is a Cow, right? And a big point first to start off our conversation is there's many definitions of what is a cow.
And that's how I, kind of motivated this article is when you think about all those reports, remember that we just talked about, different agencies use different definitions of a cow. So when we think about, for example, USDA NASS, and we're thinking about the cattle on feed reports and the cattle inventory reports, they are cows in that cattle inventory report. Really, we're thinking about the production or inventory characteristics of them. So they provide us beef cow numbers, dairy cow or milk cow numbers, and then replacement heifer numbers for both of those categories of beef and dairy. And as compared to maybe USDA's Ag Marketing Service, is more concerned about reporting those cows of how they're marketed. So given the body condition scores of those cows, the grades that those cows receive, and the relative prices that those cows receive.
And then another thing in this article, beef cattle herds are reducing. However, dairy cattle herds, maybe not so much.
When we look at that cattle inventory report, maybe a bit surprising was that the milk cow inventory was the same as a year ago. Right, as we look at margins for the dairy industry, you would maybe expect some contraction. But I think, one, the relatively high fixed cost says you got to continue to produce in the short run as long as you're covering variable costs. Now, also, I think when you look at replacement heifer prices, which USDA NASS also reports for dairy farms, those prices are relatively strong, again, given where margins are currently at. So I think there's a bit of optimism in the dairy market. I think when you look at forecasts for 2024 milk prices, there is possibility for notable increases in those prices. And then I think we have to remember that milk isn't the only thing dairy operations are producing. When you look at the price of dairy calves going into feeder cattle, those are very strong right now, right? So that is, I think, helping support some of that income and maybe some of the reason why we've not seen the contraction in the dairy industry that we expected.
Talking about crossbreds, specifically between beef and dairy cattle.
When you think about market analysis, I think one key factor there is the opportunity to maybe report those separately, as we're seeing growing use of sex semen and artificial insemination, the ability to use that for the highest percentage of dairy animals and then breed the other percentage to beef crossbreeds to really maximize the value of those calves. Now, as we think about how those animals are currently reported, USDA, there's just buckets for beef and there's buckets for dairy. And so those crossbreds go into one of those categories. Now, as we're seeing growing numbers, I think it is important for price discovery, understanding the value of those calves, what those crossbreds will bring relative to beef, relative to dairy, if we could see separate reporting of those crossbred calves. And so I think, when we think about changes to livestock mandatory reporting, that is one that comes to mind, and opportunities to, split out the animals, both the number of head as well as the prices received for those crossbreds.
That was Iowa State University livestock economist Lee Schultz. I will link the resources that he mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Monday show now with a discussion on soil pH levels when it comes to planting alfalfa. And to talk about it, we have soil fertility specialist at K-State, Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. Dorivar, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Talking about alfalfa and planting alfalfa, and so why is that important right now?
Yes, and you mentioned soil pH, and as we're thinking about planting alfalfa, of course, it's a big investment and something that we're planning for that crop to stay there for multiple years. And so we really need to take care of soil pH at this point. And specifically, I want to highlight pH because it's something that we often overlook, and we end up seeing problems later after the alfalfa get established. And being a legume is a crop that is very sensitive to low pH situations. And specifically, one of the factors is affecting nodulation. And of course, alfalfa, we want to have good nodulation and fixing that nitrogen. And so again, if that pH is below the optimum, then we start to see problems later. And again, the best time to fix it is really before we planting that alfalfa.
Dorivar, then for the state of Kansas, are there a few different target pH levels that producers need to keep in mind?
Yes, that's an excellent point. And what is the ideal pH is actually slightly different depending on where you are. And we recommend for east of the Flint Hill to try to get a target pH of close to 6.8. So that's where we like to be. Ideally above 6.4, and again even better if we are at 6.8. Now west of the Flint Hills, we recommend a lower target pH. If we are above a pH of 6, at least we are okay with that. And so why is the difference? And it's really basically go back to what you mentioned, a variability across the state in terms of soil types. And specifically, we're talking about subsoil acidity. And what happens in eastern Kansas is that the subsoil tends to have a lower pH. And again, to basically compensate for that, we need to have that higher target pH of 6.8. Now, west of the Flint Hills, again, we do have some calcareous soils. The subsoil will tend to be higher in pH. And in that situation, of course, we can afford to have a slightly lower pH. So that's the main difference, essentially, between the two regions.
When calculating for soil pH and seeing if lime is needed, how do you go about calculating lime rates then?
That's a very good point, and often a question that we get when somebody get the soil test report. The first thing that we see there is the pH, right? And that pH is basically telling us whether we will need to apply lime, yes or no. And again, that's basically considering the target pH where we would like to be. But then how do we calculate the rates of lime that we apply? There's another factor that comes into place, which is the buffer pH. And the buffer pH essentially measure the reserve acidity and how much lime is essentially needed to increase that pH. And so that's one key factor that we need to look at. And that number can change quite a bit depending on the soil types. Typically, we'll tend to see higher requirements of lime for soils that have high in clay and organic matter content, again, because the buffer of those soils are higher. And again, some of the more sandier soils usually need less lime, again, to get to that target pH that we are looking for. And so that's basically the key there. Of course, when we're talking about pH rates, we also bring the concept of effective calcium carbonate, and this is one thing that we also need to discuss and make it clear.
Can you tell us a little bit about effective calcium carbonate?
So effective calcium carbonate is a measure that we use to essentially bring all the different types of lime basically in one scale, if you will, because we have highly variable sources and types of lime. A lot of the limes that we see across the state may have different purity, essentially the concentration of calcium carbonate, and they may have different particle size and fineness, essentially. And so we bring those two components of purity and fineness to basically calculate the effective calcium carbonate. And we recommend basically pounds of effective calcium carbonate. In this way, we can basically all speak the same language, if you will, in terms of using pelt lime or different types of lime sources. We can all put in the same scale. And that's basically the key here. Again, because we have such a variability in terms of lime sources that we can get.
And with these different lime sources, how do you apply them?
And that's another key factor. And of course, when we're talking about alfalfa and thinking ahead of time, hopefully we will be able to incorporate that lime, and that's really the key here, because lime solubility tends to be low, which means incorporation and moisture is going to be a key here to really have that reaction happening in the soil, and we see the increase in pH. And so incorporating the lime will be ideal ahead of planting that alfalfa. Now we do have some situations where we're doing no-till planting alfalfa, which is something that is done in some situations. And in that case, we still broadcast on the surface. However, one key difference there is that the rate of application typically will tend to be lower. And we say typically it's going to be at least about half of the recommendation that we'll get for the full application rate. And this is very important because the key here is that lime is not very mobile in the soil. So if we are only putting on the surface, the mobility of that lime is going to be maybe 1 or 2 inches. So essentially, we're only affecting the upper 2 or 3 inches in that soil profile. And of course, again, the amount of lime we need for that is going to be roughly half, which is compared to what we will estimate for roughly a 6-inch profile if we are incorporating that lime. So this is a key difference. And again, it is very important because if we over-apply, we can have the other issues, which is basically tie-up of nutrients, especially micronutrients like zinc, iron, manganese. And of course, we don't want to have that situation either. So it is something that we have to pay close attention depending on what kind of tillage systems we have.
If producers tested their fields last year, should they go ahead and test them again this year?
Yes, that is very, very good point, and especially if we are thinking about lime application where perhaps we didn't put the full rate. I think that's something that will be very important to do, is just to see where we are, see what was the reaction of that lime and whether or not we need to do additional applications. And so that's essentially one thing that we will typically recommend, is that if we are putting lower rates, to basically retest roughly about a year later and see where we are.
And as we're talking about lime and pH levels, you need to also consider the calcium and magnesium contents that might be included in that.
Yes, and that's, of course, alfalfa is going to be a crop that's going to use quite a bit of calcium and magnesium, and those are going to be key essential elements that we're putting basically with that lime application. Of course, the pH itself is going to contribute to have access. Ideal pH is going to contribute to better access to that calcium and magnesium that we have in the soil. And, of course, we are putting calcium and magnesium with the lime as well. Now, in terms of content of calcium and magnesium with different lime sources, it can vary some. Lime sources that we have here in Kansas will typically tend to be higher in calcium, not so much in magnesium. But again, we also have some presence of magnesium content in some of the lime sources. But most importantly, again, these nutrients are typically plentiful in our soils, but we do have to have that optimum pH to have access to these nutrients. So we're really looking at both components here, application with the lime as well as access to what's already in the soil.
Dorvar, another nutrient that's important when thinking about alfalfa is phosphorus also.
Yes, and I'm glad you asked this because phosphorus and actually potassium as well, I will include it here. Alfalfa is going to be a crop that's going to remove significant amounts of these nutrients, especially potassium is as we are removing a lot of the biomass, but also phosphorus. And so these two nutrients are also something that I will definitely be looking at this point because, again, if we need to build up the soil levels of these nutrients to higher soil test levels, again, to ensure that these nutrients are at the optimum range, this will be the right time to do it. Because, again, these are also immobile nutrients, and so I will definitely be looking at this as well. If many cases pH is okay, but perhaps we need to increase that soil test phosphorus and soil test potassium a little bit more to ensure we are in the optimum range and for multiple years that we're going to be harvesting.
And as we're talking about making sure nutrients are correct and your soil is ready for alfalfa, are there a few other nutrients that producers need to keep in mind?
Yes, there are other nutrients that is definitely something that we see a need for in Kansas, and those are typically tends to be things like sulfur, and especially in southeast Kansas, we tend to see as well micronutrient like boron needs in many cases. So those are other nutrients that I will definitely keep in mind. Those, of course, we do have more flexibility in terms of application for those because tend to be more mobile nutrients, and so those can be done corrective or yearly applications later. So that's one advantage. But of course, these are things that we also need to keep in mind as we are thinking ahead for how we manage this alfalfa.
For producers, if they're thinking about getting their soil tested, K-State has a lab that can help do that.
Yes, absolutely. And working with the local extension agents, they can help to submit these samples to the K-State Soil Testing Lab or any other labs for that matter. But it's most important is to have this information on hand before planting so we avoid any issues later on after we spend all this money establishing this alfalfa.
Another resource by K-State is a publication.
Yes, we do have a publication as well in soil test interpretation and fertilizer recommendations, as well as the Alfalfa Production Handbook, which is something that you can take a look in terms of general management and guidelines for fertility and other guidelines for alfalfa.
Dorvar, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about when producers are thinking about planting alfalfa.
Thank you.
That was K-State Soil Fertility Specialist Dorvar Ruiz-Diaz. I will link the resources that he mentioned in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we end our Monday show with some information from the Wildlife Department here at Kansas State University. And today we're joined by K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Shelby.
Drew, you often come on and share some of your knowledge with us about wildlife, and something else incorporated in your work here at Kansas State University is being a teacher in the Wildlife and Outdoor Enterprise Management Program. And so could you tell us a little bit about that?
So the Wildlife and Outdoor Enterprise Management Program, which we tend to call the WOEM program, that's kind of the acronym for it, is a pretty unique wildlife program. There's only one other program at a four-year university that's like ours, but it's a science-based wildlife management program that also incorporates hospitality courses and either business or entrepreneurship courses. And it's really designed to train folks to either go on to be wildlife managers or to work on the private side of the wildlife or outdoor industry as wildlife managers at hunting ranches, or to be outfitters that could be either fishing or hunting outfitters, or to work in the shooting sports industry, or even work in business for companies like gun manufacturers or ammunition manufacturers or businesses like Cabela's or something like that.
And Drew, as we do this interview, you're actually sitting in New Mexico, which is kind of a part of the program.
It is, yeah. So we are at the Whittington Center. It is a 33,000-acre facility that's managed mostly as a shooting range, but it also has some backcountry areas and stuff like that. And we bring all the new students in our program here the week before school starts every year. And it's an opportunity for them to get to know their advisors, to get to know the other students, but we also learn about building and operating shooting ranges while we're here. They get some firearm safety training that sort of sets them up for being safe and enjoying the shooting sports classes that they will take later on in the program too.
I will have a link in today's show notes that refers people back to the Wildlife and Outdoor Enterprise Management Program at K-State if they'd like to look more into it. Now, shifting gears just a little bit to our conversation and talking about picking up twine so hopefully it doesn't end up in birds' nest.
Yeah, so there's a brand new study out that I found yesterday when I was thinking about today's program that looks at the use of baling twine by a bird of prey called the osprey, which is a bird of prey that eats fish and occurs worldwide. And they've got a really bad habit of adorning their nests or using baling twine as nesting material, and specifically that plastic or polypropylene baling twine. It's got really small fibers, and when they put it in their nests, chicks often become entangled in it. The adults sometimes become entangled in it. And when they're not found by humans before they succumb to that, it will kill them oftentimes. And they're not the only birds that use this kind of stuff as nesting material, but they're one that's well documented. In this study, almost half of the nests that they looked at in the Yellowstone River Basin over a number of years contained this polypropylene baling twine. And they saw anywhere from 3 to 6% of the chicks that were banded in this study were entangled in that baling twine. Other studies have seen up 14%. So it's not a extremely large number of birds, but it is a significant number of birds that could impact a population potentially.
And talking about bird nests and how it can be deadly and fatal to them, but also to cattle. And so it's important for producers to pick up that twine.
That's exactly right. So it's not an extremely common thing, but sometimes baling twine can become impacted in the gut of a cow or bull, and then that can kill them. So really, if we're thinking about dealing with baling twine, the best thing for both cattle production and wildlife is go ahead and pick that baling twine up and dispose of it properly so that something's not going to either ingest it or become entangled in it later on.
Drew, this study talked about osprey nests, but this conversation involves all types of birds also.
That's correct. Birds that construct stick nests, and especially larger birds like eagles, hawks, owls, and those sorts of species, collect lots of different materials. And the presence of baling twine has definitely been documented in several other raptor species that might be more common throughout Kansas than ospreys are.
Drew, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some of your knowledge.
Thank you very much for having me. I always enjoy this.
That was K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you this Monday on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with you tomorrow.